I just came back from watching the movie Ocean, narrated by Sir David Attenborough, and I have to admit, I loved it. I'm not usually a huge fan of documentaries that are this size, although everything Sir David Attenborough is a part of seems to do really well, and I really like it. But over the last couple of years, there have been some documentaries that have come out, I'm not even going to mention some of them, that have been totally off. I really like this movie. I'm going to talk about what I liked, why I liked the message of hope, and also we're going to talk about some of the controversies in this movie, because there's always controversy and there's criticism from the fishing industry. We're going to talk about the bottom trawling that was talked about in this movie, as well as the marine protected areas that was talked about in this movie on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you could speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about a movie that I just came back from seeing called Ocean. It really tells you exactly what it's all about. Ocean is by Sir David Attenborough, narrated by Sir David Attenborough. He is 99 years old, folks. 99. And for the past couple of years, he's been working on this movie that was released in theaters and selected theaters. It was a small venue for me that I went to. I usually go to these big epic movies. This was a small movie, but it was packed with great messaging. Some controversies I want to kind of clear up a little bit, and also it just opens the conversation to a lot more. Let's just say that. And I think it's really great that it does that. It was released on purpose before the Ocean Decade Conference in Nice, France. It even mentions it in the film. And it's something where it's like, hey, you know what? We need to really be able to protect our oceans and land, but our oceans especially. And we need to do that at this conference, and we need to get some great results. So it's calling on all the negotiators at this conference to come out with some great results. I will actually be there at that conference. So I'll give you the lowdown of what I experienced and what I saw at this conference. We're going to a bunch of side events, not the main conference, but I'm sure there's going to be lots to talk about. So let's get into the movie of why I loved this movie. It really comes out to the messaging. The messaging of hope. A lot of times I've seen these documentaries and they talk a lot about the destruction that's happening. A lot of times they cover everything. You know, you're looking at the major ones: overfishing, climate change, plastic pollution, water quality problems with other pollution like the industrial pollution and so forth, development along coastal lines, aquaculture and so forth. There's a lot of things that they like to cover. There's, a couple of them have covered like coral bleaching, and the messaging is very depressing throughout the entire film. There's no message of hope, and they really talk about the conservation aspect of it in the last 5 minutes, sometimes even in the credits. These aren't great documentaries because they're good at telling you what is wrong. They're not good at telling you how you can do it. And you just leave the people with this pessimism of the ocean, of what's happening around our planet, and to a point where people are just giving up. It's like, well, if we can't do anything, who cares? I'm just going to give up. It's almost like eating and getting on a diet. If you don't see the results that you want right away, you can get off that diet and you almost eat worse than what you did before when you restrict yourself. So it's really important that messaging that comes out of these documentaries like Ocean has to be positive, has to show hope. We love movies with hope. Humans love stories with hope. Hence, the Star Wars trilogies have been great with messages of hope. That's what it's all about. And that's what Ocean is all about. It's about hope. The movie starts off, spoiler warning. There's not much spoilers in this one, but spoiler warning. The movie starts off showing the beauty of the ocean. What I really love about it right at the beginning, it ties the connection of the deep sea to the surface right off the bat. We see a bait ball, we see a bunch of sharks, we see dolphins, we see whales, and then all of a sudden we see seamounts. And David Attenborough is talking about how seamounts play an important role to bring up nutrients from the bottom of the ocean, the deep sea, to the surface to feed all of these traveling species. It's really, really well done. And it talks a lot about the canyons that are down there and how many seamounts are down there, where they are. And they show this almost 3D image of the bottom of the ocean, really giving a perspective of how productive the ocean can be. I think a lot of times when we see open ocean, we see it as a barren waterway, just a water column, and we don't see much happening other than maybe a whale or two, or maybe a shark that's traveling from one place to another. We don't think about the connection between the deep sea and the surface, which right away, I think it really brings up the, how we're messing around with the deep sea too much. We're talking about deep sea mining and so forth, really gives people a perspective that it's all connected and that we need to be careful. It doesn't mention deep sea mining, but you kind of, like somebody who covers ocean all the time, I'm like, this is a great way to get people to really think about the deep sea and how it's connected to the surface and how we could benefit as humans in bringing up plankton that bring in a third of the carbon dioxide and absorb a third of the carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, and how important that is just from a climate change reduction point of view. And it doesn't talk about the productive nature of upwellings, which is bringing nutrients from the deep sea to the surface so that animals can, like whales and dolphins and tuna and all those animals, can feed off of, especially if they're migratory species. It was a great way of depicting it. I loved it right off the bat, just depicting it right away. I thought it was really well done, and it's something that I think we need to know from a perspective. Then it starts talking about different habitats around the world. We see areas in Africa, we see areas in the northern UK, we see areas in the Channel Islands, and we see a lot of different areas, a lot of different like kelp forests, and then we see these scallop beds. We get to see these coral reefs like in the Indo-Pacific and so forth. It's just a really good depiction of the different types of environments that are around. Talks about, the discovery of this massive seagrass bed that we discovered a couple of years ago, that was discovered by work done by Dr. Austin Gallagher, friend of the podcast, and his team of Beneath the Waves. It was great to see all these depicted. It wasn't just coral reefs that showed benefit. It was all these different habitats that had beautiful colors and fish from all over, and people talking about how important it is for them to fish. Talked a lot about artisanal fishers, so local fishers that are really just benefiting themselves by fishing and want to fish for generations and generations and generations, are looking to be more sustainable, working with probably scientists and governments and so forth to be more sustainable. And I think that's a really important message, especially as they get more and more into the movie, because when they get into the movie, they talk about industrial fishing. In this movie, they're focusing on industrial trawling. And they even have cameras that are hooked up to the trawls, multiple angle cameras that are hooked up to a trawl to show how devastating a trawl could be. A trawl net comes through. I've talked about this a number of times, so I'll go over it quickly. It has these doors that sink and open up the net. It has a chain that connects the doors at the beginning, the entrance of the net. It's a massive net that trails behind. And then it just scrapes the bottom with that chain, and it takes everything, every fish and critter that's in there, and it'll put it up. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more in a bit about trawling and how that could be changed and how it's optimized to be a little better. We're going to talk about that in a bit, but that's what it shows. It shows kind of the devastation that it leaves, in its path, as this wide opening, say 10 foot, maybe 20 foot wide opening net just destroys everything in its path, and it goes for a certain amount of kilometers, and then it pans out to a drone and shows the different paths, which are very narrow paths, just to look at it from that perspective. But we're going to talk a little bit about why they're showing these trawls, because they're talking about how trawls are allowed to go pretty much anywhere in certain countries. In the UK, there was a study that was released, I think I covered it on the podcast, 90% of the MPAs in the UK allow bottom trawling. Now, if you think about an MPA, which it talks about in the episode as one of those hopeful things, it says, look, here's this fishing, this devastating fishing that if you use trawling over and over and over again in the same area, it's going to destroy the habitat, and we'll get into that a little bit. But we could get away from it. It talks a lot about this depressing stuff, and you get depressing. I was watching with my daughter. My daughter says she even cried in certain situations there because it was so depressing to see these animals suffering, like invertebrates and so forth, and just a barren sea after seeing such a productive area. But then it goes into some hope. It says, hey, you know what? The ocean can recover really quickly. When it recovers really quickly is once we start telling people that you can't fish in certain areas. Certain areas that are known to be productive, and once those areas are productive and fish are allowed to come back and regulate the habitat, then they start to have a spillover effect outside the boundaries of the marine protected area. And then that spillover effect can go for kilometers depending on the species and its larval dispersal rates and everything like that. And it has such a benefit. I want you to watch the movie. So I'm not going to say the whole explanation. I want you to watch the movie because the imagery and the videography is just phenomenal. seeing the different colors of the shallows and different colors of the deep sea. It's just amazing. So you have to watch it. But that was part of the message, was this hope. I was like, oh, okay. So they're talking about a lot of depressing stuff. They didn't spend the whole movie on it, but they talked a lot about the hope in MPAs. Then they started talking about the problem with some MPAs and the way they're managed, which is great. They could have gone into a little bit more detail, but I know what they were trying to do. And then they started to come back and they say, hey, you know what? We've actually had some great things. The Channel Islands off the coast of California in the USA, the Channel Islands came back and they had a marine protected area. People said, oh, after a while, we started to see changes happening. And then we started to get record numbers of catches. In this case, it was lobster spiny. So you started to see this and you're like, okay, so this is actually working. We've seen this before in the literature. We've seen marine protected areas that, if done properly and managed properly and enforced properly, you can see a change back to the system that was productive and a change in the habitat. So that was really great. The messaging overall was like, we have hope. The ocean can recover. There are people that can do some really great things. They talked also about Antarctica and some of the trawling that's happening in Antarctica for krill and how the whales are using that area, the Southern Ocean, to get krill, and now they're running out of food. So what's going to happen with the whales? They even talked about the recovery near the end, especially, which I thought was really interesting. They talked about how we've done this before, where we've taken animals to the brink of extinction, i.e. whales, when we used to hunt whales back in the 1800s, almost to extinction, because we used to hunt whales for fuel. That's how we got fuel. That's how we burnt all the lights and everything like that, and had the lights stay on. They would burn slower. That was our energy. And so we hunted whales to the brink until we said, you know what, we've discovered oil and gas. Oil and gas became the main producer of energy. People wanted to stop hunting the whales, eventually stopped. There's certain countries that still do. But for the most part, we've seen a recovery of humpback whales, of bowhead whales, of a lot of different whales out there, blue whales that, were hunted to almost extinction. And now we've seen, they're great conservation stories. If we put together conservation wins, we can really do a good job. Now, here's what they talked about right at the end. Before the credits, they basically wrote on text on the screen, basically saying that the Ocean Decade Conference is coming up in Nice, France, where countries are going to be negotiating and trying to sign and talk about what the work that they've been doing to protect 30% of the ocean by 2030 and 30% of their controlled, exclusive economic zone. And they call for those countries to do a better job, to get more protection faster, because there's only globally, there's less than 3% of the ocean protected, but we're seeing a lot of productivity come from that 3%, and we're also seeing others. Now, there's a lot of issues surrounding MPAs and designated MPAs. One, it's not really an issue, but it takes a long time. It takes a long time because it's conflict management. You are telling people who used to be able to fish or do anything in a certain area that they're going to be restricted from doing that activity in that area. It's not just fishing, it's any kind of extractive type. So it could be oil and gas, it could be mining, it could be development, it could be even recreational activities, depending on how bad that area is. So you have to do a lot of conflict management, you have to do a lot of compromising, a lot of negotiation to get an area protected. And once you get that area protected, which could take anywhere from a year to 10 years, even longer to get protected, then you have to enforce it and you have to manage it and you have to go through adaptive management process to change the management with, different types of changes that are going on in the world. A lot of stuff going on there. That was really interesting to see. They didn't mention that. In Antarctica, there is the eastern part of the ocean, Antarctica, the Southern Ocean, that they want to protect. They've been trying to get it protected for over 10 years. And Antarctica is managed by 24, 25 countries, including China and Russia, who keep, blocking the vote to get this area protected. They did protect the Ross MPA or the Ross Sea, which was great, but now they want to protect this other area to not only protect krill, but other fish like what they call the Chilean sea bass, which is a different fish. I think it's called Patagonian toothfish. And so people are trying to protect, but it's hard to protect these areas. So there's a lot of different issues. And then we talk about the enforcement. The UK allows bottom trawling in 90% of its marine protected areas. That's got to change because you can't protect an area. You're not just protecting a species. You can't protect an area because that's where they live, that's where they eat, that's where they interact. You have to protect that area. You can't let bottom trawling, a destructive fishing practice that will come through and destroy a particular part of the habitat. If that continues to happen over and over and over again, even if it starts off as narrow bands, that can increase and increase as bottom trawling continues to happen. So there's got to be some restriction of extractive processes in marine protected areas. In fact, it was argued that you don't really have a marine protected area if you allow extractive processes like fish bottom trawling in marine protected areas. So there are a lot of things that happen that have to be stopped. Now let's talk a little bit about trawling. Trawling is a destructive practice. Like I talked about before, it scrapes the bottom. There are different types of trawls. There's bottom trawling. There's like mid-water column trawling, where basically the trawl goes through the water column. It doesn't actually hit the bottom, and it takes anything in the area. I think the krill are going through like the mid-column trawling, but it doesn't destroy the bottom, but it does take a lot depending on how big the net. It does, and in the oceans, it shows that they're pretty big nets and a lot of processing going on at sea before it gets taken to shore. And so there's obviously problems with it, but it does take a narrow band. So if managed properly, maybe you can say, hey, yeah, we could actually do this, but you can't, there's certain times you'll be able to trawl. If you take a narrow band in a productive area and you don't fish beyond that, that band will fill in with other organisms as succession happens in ecology. But, you have to be careful and manage that. It's very difficult to manage at sea when you're not there all the time. And then, people can just go, they'll beg for forgiveness instead of asking for permission at sea, and they'll just keep trawling. So you do have to be careful with that. There have been advancements in trawling in terms of net size, in terms of exclusion devices, such as sea turtle exclusion devices. I think there are also for some like dolphins as well, where it allows these animals to get out of the net and be able to survive. There's mesh sizes which allow to be more selective in terms of the type of fish. So they'll have larger mesh sizes for larger fish, so the smaller fish can go through the mesh and they won't get caught, trying to reduce bycatch. But I did look up some statistics on it. And so according to some sources, bottom trawling accounts for approximately 25% of the world's wild-caught seafood. And when you include midwater trawling, collectively it contributes just over 1/3, so just over 30% of global fish catches. In Canada, I want to get something specific. In Canada, it's about 6.5% of the national fish catch is obtained through trawling methods. The bycatch concern is that the bycatch is estimated at 23%, indicating a significant portion of non-target species caught and discarded. In the U.S., the trawl percentage accounts for approximately 4% of the catch from trawling activities, and then the bycatch is nearly 50%. Now, UK, as I mentioned, 90% of the MPAs have permitted to have bottom trawling, but the trawling stands for approximately 3.7% of the fish catch, the nation's fish catch. So maybe it's not actually happening, even though 90% of the MPAs allow it to happen. It may not be happening everywhere. Other notable countries that have some significant trawling, approximately 65% of its seafood in the Netherlands is caught by bottom trawling. In Morocco, also reports about 65% is caught from bottom trawling. And then Vietnam, bottom trawling accounts for 59% of its seafood catch. So now, obviously, when you're looking at bottom trawling, you're worried about habitat destruction. You're also worried about high bycatch rates. So non-targeted species, including endangered marine life, are caught and discarded, leading to ecological imbalances. And then, of course, carbon emissions was mentioned in the ocean. As you start to dredge out the bottom, sediment starts to get moved and carbon dioxide gets released into the atmosphere. There's some recent studies that say that it may release substantial amounts of carbon dioxide by disturbing carbon-rich sediments on the ocean floor. So there's a lot going on with bottom trawling, not the best fishing method. Obviously, there's certain countries that depend a lot on it, and there's other countries that don't depend a lot on it. And of course, the management of MPAs varies from country to country to country. The UN came out with some stipulations in terms of what a marine protected area is, and they kind of follow that. And then we're also seeing more conservation coming in near shore, as I talked about a couple of weeks ago with Angelo Villagomez and Alia Hadiat from the Center of American Progress, talking about how nearshore protection should start to ramp up and increase, because we're doing a lot on offshore, but we're not doing as much on the inshore, which is the harder place to do it. The coastal area is the harder place where we are going to be having problems in conflict resolution that has to take place before we can start to protect those. One of the things they talked about, Papahanaumakuakea, the marine sanctuary off the islands of Hawaii, or just northern islands of Hawaii, which is a huge place that has a great spillover effect. Obviously, that was the subject matter of some controversy a couple months ago when Donald Trump opened it up to fishing. So that's going to be a problem, but there's a big focus on this in the movie. They talk a lot about how the size of it's great and everything is doing well, and it's increased catch rates by 54% outside the marine protected area, which is all wonderful. The one thing, though, that we should mention is that in areas where it's overseas territories, such as the Hawaiian Islands, I guess it's not really territory, it's a state, but still, like in those areas where it's indigenous led, It's great to have that protection because especially with indigenous-led marine protected areas, it's usually pretty good because it's part of their culture. However, a lot of the bigger marine protected areas are in areas where there's a big indigenous population. There's less in the main population, the non-indigenous population, because it's harder to do and it becomes more conflicting. And we tried to do one of the sea mountain canyons in the US just off the coast of Massachusetts. I don't know if it ever got brought back, but now that Donald Trump is in power, I'm sure it was an executive order when it first came in under the Obama administration. Donald Trump took it away. I think Biden took it back. I'm sure it's got back stripped down again. So these are big problems that happen not only in the US, but all over the world. MPAs are not easy to designate, which, the movie made it sound like it could be. It's not an easy thing. It works when it's done properly and it's enforced and it's managed properly. But when it's not, or it takes a long time to get it approved, destruction continues to happen. And there's always, countries who are wanting to get on top. The Papahanaumokuakea got opened up because, the U.S. wanted to be number one in the Pacific for fishing. Pretty much that was the reason. So that's a big problem when you talk about MPAs and trying to keep MPAs intact and protected. So lots of stuff going on. Great message of hope. The fact that it's, hey, you know what? There's our ways to do it. We just have to do it. We just have to actually go out and execute and put in more marine protected areas, get up to that 30% or as close as possible by 2030, and just continue to work at it and work at it and work at it. So I hope you have a chance to go see it. I don't know what's going to happen. This was a release. It came out a little later in Canada than it did in the UK when it was first released at the beginning of the month in May. But I highly recommend that you go get it. I hope they put it out on Netflix or on some streaming channel that everybody can get access to, because I think it'll make a lot more waves, no pun intended. But I hope you get to see, if you've seen it and you want to let me know what you thought about it, please let me know in the comments down below if you're watching this on YouTube, or you can go to speakupforblue.com/contact, fill out the form, let me know what you thought of the movie, or if you're looking forward to seeing the movie. And then, of course, you can always hit me up on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. That's at How to Protect the Ocean. I want to thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.